Poor single mom returned her baby's milk. Millionaire's next move left everyone shocked. If you love American stories full of culture and emotion, subscribe now, like, comment what you think about this story, and share this video so more people can enjoy them too. The fluorescent lights of the Mega Mart hummed above Eleanor Vance as she pushed her cart forward. Her eyes burned from another double shift at the diner, and her hands gripped the handle with the weight of exhaustion. Daisy, her baby, squirmed in the cart seat, clutching a toy that had lost its color long ago. Eleanor forced a tired smile for her daughter. Inside, though, her chest ached with dread. She knew her paycheck had already run dry. The line moved slowly, each beep of the scanner stretching time like a cruel reminder of what she didn't have. She placed the baby formula on the counter, her most urgent purchase, the one thing she couldn't do without. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her worn purse, pulling out folded bills and loose coins. She already knew the math wouldn't work. She had been running the numbers in her head since yesterday. The cashier gave her a polite smile, but it faded as the register flashed the total. Eleanor's stomach twisted. The money in her palm wasn't enough. Not even close. A cold wave of humiliation crashed over her, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks. The people behind her shifted impatiently, their carts piled high with groceries she could only dream of. Daisy cooed softly, aware of her mother's sinking heart. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled the can of formula back toward her, pushing it aside with the shaking hand. "I'll have to return this one." The words cut deeper than any insult could. They were words no mother should ever have to say. The cashier nodded kindly, but Eleanor saw pity in her eyes. That pity was worse than judgment. It was a mirror of her failure. A hush seemed to fall over the line, though the store buzzed as usual. Eleanor kept her eyes down, ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. She grabbed Daisy's toy and tried to distract herself with her daughter's innocent smile, but the sting remained. One can of formula. One symbol of how close to the edge she was living. She gathered her small bag of groceries, trying to move quickly, desperate to escape. As she turned, the voices around her blurred into a dull hum. Every step toward the exit felt like walking through molasses, heavy and slow. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the parking lot night where no one could see her weakness. Her pride fought against the tears pressing at her eyes. Eleanor had promised herself she'd be strong for Daisy, but strength was getting harder to find. Near the doors, the weight of the moment grew unbearable. She remembered her great-grandfather's stories of surviving hardships with dignity, of never letting the world see you crumble. She clung to those memories like a lifeline. But tonight, that legacy felt distant, like a faded photograph in a drawer. She whispered an apology to Daisy, who reached for her with tiny, trusting hands. That trust was both her anchor and her torment. Behind her, a man's voice spoke softly, though she didn't catch the words. She assumed it was another customer, maybe offering sympathy she didn't want. She pressed forward, quickening her pace, determined to get outside before her mask of composure shattered. The automatic doors opened, letting in the cool night air. She felt both relief and defeat as she stepped out into the dark. The parking lot was half lit, a mix of flickering lamps and long shadows. Eleanor pushed the cart toward her old sedan, every squeak of the wheels echoing her thoughts. She hated herself for hoping no one she knew had seen what just happened. She hated even more that Daisy's next meal was now uncertain. The weight of survival pressed harder than the night itself. As Eleanor loaded her few groceries into the car, she felt eyes on her. She brushed it off as paranoia. But somewhere behind her, near the sliding doors of the store, a quiet figure lingered. He had seen everything. He had noticed what others had ignored. And in that moment, Eleanor's world unknowingly shifted, though she was too tired to realize it. James Caldwell had come to the Mega Mart that evening with one purpose: to spend time with his daughter, Sophia. Despite his billions and his empire, he wanted her to know what a normal errand felt like. The simple act of choosing apples or cereal together. He pushed the cart slowly, listening to her chatter about colors and shapes, soaking in her laughter. But his mind wasn't entirely at ease. The shadows of loneliness followed him, even here. Sophia tugged at his sleeve as they reached the checkout area. "Dad, look," she whispered, pointing at the young woman in line ahead. James followed his daughter's gaze and noticed the tremor in Eleanor's hands as she fumbled with her money. The sight struck him harder than he expected. He watched her shoulders slump as she returned the formula, the quiet dignity in her defeat. Something in the scene felt painfully familiar. Memories of his own grandfather's stories surfaced, tales of men broken by war yet holding their heads high. James had grown up hearing about sacrifices, about debts that could never truly be repaid. Now, in the fluorescent glow of the store, he saw a woman carrying her own invisible war. His heart tightened as he realized he couldn't simply turn away. Compassion rose within him, undeniable and urgent. When Eleanor left the line, James made a decision. He leaned toward the cashier and gestured discreetly to the can of formula she had set aside. "Add that to mine," he said quietly. The cashier hesitated, surprised, then nodded. Sophia's eyes lit up, though she didn't fully understand the weight of the moment. James slipped his card across the counter, his expression steady but thoughtful. He carried the formula in his hand as he and Sophia moved toward the exit. Eleanor was already outside, her cart squeaking across the parking lot. James hesitated for a moment, considering whether to follow. He wasn't sure how she would react. People in pain often built walls around themselves. Still, he couldn't ignore the pull of responsibility, as if fate had placed him in that checkout line for a reason. Sophia tugged again, her small voice breaking the silence. "Daddy, are we helping her?" The innocence in her question cut through his hesitation. James smiled softly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," he murmured. "We're helping her." It wasn't just about a can of formula anymore. It was about something larger, something that carried echoes of his family's past and his own need for meaning. Outside, Eleanor struggled to load her groceries into the car. James approached slowly, keeping his steps measured so he wouldn't startle her. The night air carried the faint scent of gasoline and asphalt, grounding him in the moment. Sophia skipped beside him, holding tightly to his hand. The formula felt heavy in his grasp, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a chance to ease someone's burden. "Excuse me," James said gently when he was close enough. Eleanor froze, turning quickly, her eyes wary. She recognized him from the checkout line. Her expression hardened with pride, ready to refuse whatever she thought he was about to offer. James held out the formula, careful not to make it seem like charity. "You left this behind," he said simply, though both of them knew it wasn't the full truth. Eleanor stared at the can, her throat tightening. She wanted to refuse, to walk away, to prove she didn't need anyone's help. But Daisy's face flashed in her mind, her tiny body depending on this very thing. Silence stretched between them, filled with tension and unspoken words. James waited patiently, offering no judgment, only quiet resolve. His daughter watched curiously, sensing the importance of the moment. At last, Eleanor reached out, her hand brushing his as she took the formula. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of both pride and need. James nodded once, not pushing further, not asking for gratitude. He simply turned with Sophia, walking back into the night. Eleanor stood by her car, shaken but holding the formula close. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet stranger had just altered the course of her life. Eleanor held the formula tightly as James and his daughter walked away, her heart torn between gratitude and resentment. She despised the idea of being someone's charity case, especially in front of her little girl. Yet the can in her arms was undeniable proof that Daisy would not go hungry tonight. Pride battled need in her chest like fire against ice, each one refusing to yield. She whispered a quiet thank you to the night, though not to the man who had given it. Driving home, the old sedan rattled with every bump in the road, a mirror of her shaking thoughts. She replayed the moment over and over, hearing her own voice crack when she had said, "Thank you." It didn't feel like a victory, it felt like surrender. Daisy babbled in the back seat, her tiny laughter cutting through Eleanor's shame like sunlight through storm clouds. For her daughter's sake, she forced herself to keep driving forward. Her pride screamed that James had only acted out of pity, that men like him never understood the reality of women like her. She had seen kindness before, and it often came with hidden strings. Whether it was condescension, expectation, or a reminder of her place, it always left a scar. Eleanor vowed not to let this stranger into her life, no matter how generous his intentions seemed. Daisy deserved stability, not favors from passing do-gooders. But as she stopped at a red light, Eleanor glanced at the can in the passenger seat. Hunger had no mercy, and her baby's needs had no time for pride. She sighed, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Maybe she didn't have the luxury of refusing help anymore. Still, she swore she would never depend on anyone again, not after all she'd been through. This was survival, nothing more. Meanwhile, James drove in silence across town, Sophia humming a tune in the back seat. The can of formula no longer in his hands, he felt an unexpected emptiness. He hadn't intended to interfere, but something about Eleanor's quiet strength had unsettled him. He remembered his grandfather's stories of dignity in hardship, and felt echoes of that same spirit in her. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to do more, but he restrained himself. Sophia's innocent question lingered in his mind. "Daddy, are we helping her?" He had answered yes, but deep down, he wondered if buying formula was really enough. People like Eleanor needed more than charity. They needed doors opened. He told himself not to push, that it wasn't his place. But fate had a way of planting seeds in the most unexpected soil, and tonight, a seed had been planted in his heart. Back in her neighborhood, Eleanor parked beside the cracked pavement of her apartment building. The worn brick walls looked the same as always, tired, neglected, as though they too were weighed down by overdue bills. Carrying Daisy in one arm and groceries in the other, Eleanor tried to focus only on the small victories: a roof over their heads, a meal on the table, and a baby safe in her arms. Gratitude was easier when she thought small. Still, James Caldwell's face wouldn't leave her thoughts. His expression hadn't been smug or condescending, it had been steady, even kind. That unsettled her most of all. She didn't want to believe a man of his wealth could act without motive. Trust was dangerous, and trust had cost her before. Tonight, though, she was too tired to unravel the knots of suspicion in her mind. All she wanted was sleep. She set Daisy in her crib, the baby cooing as if nothing in the world was wrong. Eleanor pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, the warmth reminding her of what really mattered. Maybe she didn't have everything, but she had Daisy, and that was enough. Pride and gratitude could war all they wanted inside her heart. Tomorrow, she would still wake up and fight for her little girl. As she turned off the light, Eleanor whispered into the darkness, "I can do this. We don't need anyone else." But even as she said it, a small, uninvited doubt lingered. Perhaps the quiet stranger had given her more than formula. Perhaps, without realizing it, he had given her a glimpse of hope. That hope frightened her more than hunger ever could. Morning came too soon, dragging Eleanor from restless dreams into the harsh reality of her small apartment. The leaky faucet in the kitchen dripped like a ticking clock, each drop a reminder of problems she couldn't afford to fix. She shuffled through the cluttered living room, sidestepping piles of laundry and unpaid bills stacked on the coffee table. This was her battlefield, and every corner told the story of a war against poverty. She filled Daisy's bottle with careful precision, measuring each scoop of formula like it was gold. Every ounce mattered. She couldn't afford waste, not with the can sitting like a fragile treasure on the counter. Daisy's wide eyes followed her mother's movements, unaware of the sacrifices behind them. To Eleanor, that innocence was both a blessing and a burden. It pushed her forward while reminding her how much she had left to prove. The ceiling above the crib bore a dark water stain, spreading wider with each storm. Eleanor had reported it months ago, but the landlord never returned her calls. She stared at the stain now, her jaw tightening with frustration. It was another symbol of how little control she had. She wanted better for Daisy, a home without leaks and broken locks. But for now, this cramped apartment was all they had. Bills waited for her on the table like vultures, each envelope stamped with warnings in red ink. Electricity, rent, medical, every demand screamed louder than the last. Eleanor sat down and rubbed her temples, calculating what little money she had left after rent. No matter how she rearranged the numbers, they never balanced. Survival felt like juggling knives, always one mistake away from disaster. She thought about James, about how easily he had paid for the formula without hesitation. To him, it was nothing. To her, it was everything. The contrast gnawed at her pride, making her feel small. She hated herself for even thinking about him again. She couldn't afford to rely on someone like that. Men with money and power lived in a world far removed from hers. Yet his act lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Eleanor forced herself to focus on work. She packed Daisy's small bag, tucking in a worn blanket and a bottle. Her neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, would watch Daisy today, as she often did for a few dollars. Eleanor felt guilty leaving her baby in someone else's care, but she had no choice. The diner shifts weren't forgiving, and without them, there would be no roof at all. Every goodbye felt like a wound, even if only for the day. At the diner, the hours stretched endlessly, plates clattering and orders flying from the kitchen. Eleanor smiled for customers, though her body begged for rest. She carried trays heavier than her frame should manage, but she had learned long ago that fatigue wasn't an option. Her co-workers chatted about vacations and new clothes, things Eleanor hadn't dreamed of in years. For her, survival was the only luxury. By the time she returned home, the apartment felt smaller than ever. Daisy greeted her with a squeal, arms reaching up, and Eleanor's exhaustion melted for a moment. She lifted her daughter high, laughing despite the heaviness in her bones. These were the moments that kept her going, the fragments of joy that outshined the darkness. If love could pay bills, they would have been rich already. But love couldn't fix the peeling paint or the broken heater. Love couldn't erase the eviction notices that seemed to creep closer each month. Eleanor laid Daisy back in her crib, staring again at the water stain above. The silence of the apartment pressed in, filled with all the worries she couldn't say aloud. She whispered promises into the night, praying that somehow she would keep them. As she closed her eyes, Eleanor thought again of the man at the Mega Mart. She hated that he lingered in her thoughts, but she couldn't deny the ripple his kindness had made. Tomorrow would bring the same struggles, the same battles against hunger and debt. Yet for the first time in a long while, a sliver of possibility had crept into her heart. And possibility, however fragile, was a dangerous thing. The next morning, James sat in his study, the hum of the city beyond his glass windows, a constant reminder of the world he ruled. On his desk lay a simple envelope, not embossed with his company's seal or stamped with wealth, but plain, almost humble. Inside was an invitation to the local Veterans Community Center, a place often overlooked yet rich with stories of sacrifice. He had arranged for Eleanor's name to be added quietly, without her knowledge. He thought of his grandfather's voice, gravelly with age, recounting nights in muddy trenches and the men who never returned. There had always been one man mentioned more than others, a man who had pulled him from certain death. James had grown up believing debts like that never died. Now, watching Eleanor's face replay in his mind, he felt compelled to honor that belief in his own way. Across town, Eleanor finished her shift at the diner, her body aching in ways she no longer bothered to name. She checked Daisy's small bag before picking her up from Mrs. Lopez, making sure the formula was measured perfectly. Each scoop still felt like gold dust. On her walk back, she stopped at her mailbox, expecting nothing more than bills and flyers. What she found instead was the envelope, addressed in tidy script. Suspicion tightened in her chest. She tore it open slowly, reading the neat words that invited her to a program at the Veterans Community Center. Training opportunities, childcare, and family support services were listed like promises on a page. It sounded too good to be real. Eleanor scanned the block, half expecting to see James lurking in the shadows. But the street was quiet, just neighbors going about their lives. At home, she placed the envelope on the counter beside the fragile can of formula. The sight of the two together stirred something complicated in her heart: pride, fear, curiosity. She didn't want to owe anyone, yet the words "childcare provided" whispered temptations she couldn't ignore. For the first time in weeks, she considered the possibility of stepping outside survival mode, even just for a day. Daisy gurgled from her crib, waving her arms as though cheering for a future she didn't yet understand. Eleanor picked her up, holding her close as the invitation burned in her hand. She thought of her great-grandfather, a man who had once told her, "Opportunities don't come dressed in gold. Sometimes they come in plain envelopes." It felt like he was speaking to her even now. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She traced the ink of the invitation with her finger, wondering if she was foolish to even think about going. What if it was a trap? Another reminder of where she didn't belong. Yet something inside her whispered that she couldn't keep turning away from every outstretched hand. Not if she wanted Daisy to see more than 4 leaking walls. The next morning, she dressed carefully, pulling on her least worn-out clothes. She brushed Daisy's tiny curls, humming softly to hide her nerves. As she tucked the invitation into her purse, she promised herself this wasn't surrender. It was reconnaissance, a mother scouting for hope. If the place felt wrong, she'd walk out with her head high. On the bus ride across town, Eleanor watched the city blur past the window-towering buildings. Busy streets, people in a hurry to lives she couldn't imagine. She clutched Daisy's hand, whispering a silent vow that she would never stop searching for a better path. The invitation wasn't money, but it might be something far greater, a door. When the bus stopped, she stepped down onto the cracked sidewalk in front of the community center. Its brick walls looked worn but sturdy, like they had weathered more storms than she could count. She adjusted Daisy on her hip and took a deep breath. Today, her story was about to brush against someone else's. The glass doors of the community center creaked as Eleanor pushed them open. Daisy balanced on her hip. Inside, the scent of coffee and old books greeted her, warm and grounding. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a playroom down the hall, mixing with the low hum of adult conversation. Eleanor hesitated at the entrance, unsure if she was welcome. Behind a desk stood a woman in her 50s, her silver-streaked hair tied neatly in a bun. She wore no jewels, no designer clothes, just a navy cardigan and eyes sharp with both kindness and scrutiny. "You must be Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had seen everything. "I'm Mrs. Gable. We've been expecting you." Eleanor stiffened, her pride bristling. "Expecting me?" she echoed, clutching Daisy tighter. The thought of James arranging this felt intrusive, like he had slipped past walls she hadn't agreed to lower. "But Mrs. Gable's expression softened, as if she sensed the storm behind Eleanor's words. "Yes, Mrs. Gable," replied calmly. "A friend thought you might find something useful here. Skills training, childcare, connections. No strings attached." She tilted her head toward the playroom. "Would you like to take a look?" Daisy squealed at the sound of children's voices, wriggling in Eleanor's arms as though answering for her. Reluctantly, Eleanor followed. The playroom was simple but bright, walls covered in crayon drawings, shelves stacked with toys that didn't look brand new but were loved. Daisy's eyes lit up, and Eleanor felt her defenses waver. For once, her daughter could be part of something that didn't carry the scent of desperation. Back in the main hall, Mrs. Gable poured coffee into a paper cup and handed it to Eleanor. "You look like you need this," she said, her tone neither pitying nor casual, but matter of fact. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cup, surprised by the warmth spreading through her chest. It had been a long time since anyone had noticed what she needed. They sat together on a worn couch near the window. Mrs. Gable listened more than she spoke, nodding as Eleanor, against her better judgment, shared fragments of her struggle. Double shifts, bills that never balanced, the constant tug-of-war between pride and survival. Mrs. Gable didn't interrupt. She simply let Eleanor's words settle in the air, giving them weight. "Eleanor," she said at last, "you have more strength than you realize. But strength isn't meant to be carried alone. This place exists because people before you chose to fight for dignity together. Don't let pride trick you into thinking you're alone." Her voice was steady, not demanding but firm, like a teacher guiding a student. Eleanor blinked back sudden tears, startled by the truth in those words. She thought of the envelope, of James' quiet gesture, of Daisy's trusting eyes. Maybe this wasn't charity. Maybe it was a chance to step into a world where survival wasn't the only goal. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely invisible. As Daisy played with blocks in the corner, Eleanor looked around the room. The walls weren't grand, the floors weren't polished, but the place breathed resilience. Mrs. Gable's presence felt like both anchor and compass, pointing her towards something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. When Eleanor finally rose to leave, Mrs. Gable touched her arm lightly. "Come back tomorrow. Bring Daisy. We'll start from there." Eleanor nodded, her voice caught in her throat. For once, the future didn't look like a closed door. It looked like the beginning of a path she hadn't dared to walk. The community center buzzed with life the following week. Eleanor returned with Daisy, trying to blend into the background while observing the programs offered. She didn't want to attract attention, but her presence did not go unnoticed. From across the room, Penelope Covington watched with sharp, calculating eyes. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of the world Eleanor had never belonged to. Penelope was a long-standing board member, her family name etched into plaques on the center's walls. To her, this place wasn't just charity, it was legacy and influence. Seeing Eleanor, a young single mother with no pedigree, unsettled her sense of order. She leaned toward another board member, whispering something behind a polished smile. Her words carried the faint edge of disdain. Eleanor, unaware of the scrutiny, helped Daisy settle among the toys. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, watching her daughter laugh with other children. Mrs. Gable greeted her warmly, offering another cup of coffee. Eleanor held onto it like an anchor, grateful for the simple kindness. Yet Penelope's eyes never left her. Later that afternoon, Penelope approached Mrs. Gable with the confidence of someone used to being heard. "I see you've taken on a new project," she said smoothly, gesturing toward Eleanor. "Are we certain this is the kind of candidate we want representing the center?" The implication hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Gable's expression tightened, but she remained calm. "Every family that walks through those doors deserves dignity," Mrs. Gable replied firmly. "That includes Eleanor." Penelope's painted smile never wavered, but her mind began working. She was not one to accept challenges lightly. To her, Eleanor was a disruption, a variable she hadn't chosen. And variables, in Penelope's world, were to be controlled. That evening, Eleanor sensed something had shifted. She couldn't name it, but whispers trailed her as she walked through the hall. Board members glanced her way with polite, guarded expressions. Pride pressed her to lift her chin higher, even as doubt pricked at her confidence. She reminded herself she was here for Daisy, not for approval. James Caldwell arrived that same week, meeting briefly with Mrs. Gable in her office. From the hallway, Eleanor caught a glimpse of him, sharp suit, calm demeanor, Sophia skipping by his side. She felt a rush of conflicting emotions, gratitude, suspicion, and an ache she didn't want to name. Penelope noticed the glance too, and her suspicions deepened. In Penelope's mind, the pieces began to arrange themselves into a story she could use. A struggling woman, suddenly connected to one of the wealthiest men in the city. How convenient. To her, it looked less like fate and more like manipulation. She made a mental note to dig deeper, to expose what she was certain would be flaws in Eleanor's story. As Eleanor left that day, Daisy asleep in her arms, she caught Penelope's gaze. It was brief, but sharp enough to leave a sting. Eleanor didn't know the woman's name yet, but she felt the weight of her judgment. Something told her this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. And as the glass doors closed behind her, Penelope's resolve hardened. Eleanor Vance was no longer just a stranger in need, she was a threat to the order Penelope cherished. And Penelope had no intention of letting her slip quietly into their world without a fight. James sat in his study late one night, the city skyline glowing beyond his windows. Papers from the community center lay scattered across his desk, but one caught his eye. It was a list of recent participants, and among the names was Eleanor Vance. The surname stirred something familiar, a ghost from his grandfather's old stories. He leaned back, lost in thought. He remembered evenings spent at his grandfather's side, listening to tales of the war. One name had surfaced more than once, a soldier named Vance, who had saved his grandfather during a brutal campaign in Europe. Could it be coincidence? James pulled open a drawer, retrieving the faded journal his grandfather had left him. Flipping through the pages, James found the entry. Private Thomas Vance. It read, "The man who dragged me through the mud when the shells rained down." James traced the letters with his finger, a shiver running through him. Could Eleanor truly be his descendant? The idea felt almost impossible, yet undeniable. Meanwhile, Eleanor tucked Daisy into bed after another long shift. She thought about the community center, about Mrs. Gable's encouragement, and about the wealthy man who had set all this into motion. Gratitude pressed against suspicion, making her restless. She told herself not to dream too much, not to imagine doors opening that might slam shut. The next day, James returned to the center with Sophia. Spotting Eleanor in the playroom, he felt a pull stronger than before. Their eyes met briefly, and he wanted to speak, to share what he had discovered. But caution held him back. How would she react if he mentioned their family's connection? It could sound like pity, or worse, manipulation. Eleanor sensed his gaze, but kept her distance. She could not afford to be swept into his world of wealth and polished shoes. The gap between them was too wide, and she knew kindness from men like him often came with costs. Still, something about his steady presence unsettled her resolve. Later, James approached Mrs. Gable in private, asking quietly about Eleanor's background. Mrs. Gable offered little, respecting Eleanor's privacy, but her knowing look told him enough. James decided he would confirm the truth on his own before saying anything to Eleanor. He wanted certainty before he crossed that fragile bridge. Back in her apartment, Eleanor found herself humming to Daisy, remembering her great-grandfather's stories of courage. She had always thought of those tales as distant, almost mythical. Little did she know, those very stories were threads tying her fate to James Caldwell's family. For now, though, she only felt the weight of survival. As James closed his grandfather's journal that night, he knew this discovery could change everything. Their meeting hadn't been random, it was part of a legacy that demanded acknowledgement. The question was whether Eleanor would see it the same way, or retreat further behind her pride. And so, while Penelope sharpened her suspicions, another truth quietly bloomed between Eleanor and James. It was a bridge built not of money or charity, but of sacrifice carried across generations. Neither of them yet understood its full weight, but destiny was drawing them closer with every step. The community center's hallways buzzed with quiet activity, but Eleanor felt eyes trailing her every step. At first, she thought it was her imagination, just the weight of her own insecurities. But then she noticed the subtle glances, the polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. It was the kind of silence that said more than words ever could. Penelope had been busy. At luncheons and board meetings, her words dripped like honey laced with poison. She questioned Eleanor's background, suggesting she was manipulating James Caldwell for personal gain. The rumors spread quickly, slipping into corners of the community like smoke. Eleanor didn't need to hear them directly. She could feel their sting in the air. At the playroom, mothers whispered while pretending to watch their children. Eleanor held Daisy close, focusing on her daughter's laughter to drown out the murmur. But it was impossible to ignore the way conversations hushed when she walked by. Pride pushed her chin up, but inside, doubt gnawed at her like a relentless tide. Mrs. Gable noticed the shift too. She watched Eleanor with sharper concern, sensing the storm gathering around her. She offered quiet reassurances, telling Eleanor that gossip had no power if ignored. But Eleanor wasn't sure she believed that. Words, she knew, could ruin lives faster than any debt or bill. James, meanwhile, remained unaware of the full extent of Penelope's whispers. He visited the center with Sophia, smiling as Daisy and his daughter played together. To him, Eleanor seemed steady, though quieter than before. He wanted to bridge the gap between them, but her guarded expressions told him she was pulling away. Penelope, satisfied with the effect, pressed harder. She told select donors that Eleanor's presence was questionable and hinted at impropriety with James. Though she never said the words outright, her implications were sharp enough to wound. Each insinuation grew like a weed, choking the fragile hope Eleanor had begun to feel. At home, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, unpaid bills piled around her. The silence of the apartment pressed in heavier than ever. She whispered to herself that she didn't care what they thought, but the truth cut deeper. Every rumor threatened not just her dignity, but Daisy's future at the center. Her great-grandfather's words echoed faintly in her memory. Never let them define you. But pride and fear clashed within her chest, leaving her sleepless. For years, survival had been her only fight. Now, she faced a battle she hadn't prepared for, one against whispers and shadows. Still, Eleanor forced herself to return to the center the next morning. Daisy deserved the chance to laugh, to play, to feel normal. She walked through the glass doors with her head held high, though her stomach twisted. Behind her calm steps, though, the war inside her raged on, and Penelope, watching from across the hall, smiled faintly. To her, Eleanor's resolve was nothing more than the calm before the storm. The whispers had done their work, and cracks had already begun to show. The weight of gossip soon spread beyond the center. Eleanor's co-workers at the diner began asking questions, their voices lined with curiosity and judgment. "So, who's the rich guy you've been seen with?" one asked, half smiling. Eleanor's cheeks burned, and she brushed the comment aside, but the words lingered long after the shift ended. Money troubles deepened, pressing harder with each overdue notice. Her landlord left another warning taped to the door, bright red letters demanding rent she didn't have. The old sedan coughed and wheezed on the drive home, another reminder that even her car was close to failing. It seemed every corner of her life was closing in at once. At the community center, Daisy's laughter no longer gave Eleanor the same relief. Instead, it became a painful reminder of what she stood to lose if Penelope succeeded. She imagined doors closing, opportunities slipping away, all because of lies whispered by people who never knew her struggle. The thought hollowed her out. One evening, exhaustion and shame collided. Eleanor sank into the couch, Daisy asleep in her crib, and buried her face in her hands. Tears came hot and fast, breaking through the wall she had built. For the first time in months, she let herself admit how tired she truly was. The fight felt endless, and her spirit wavered. Meanwhile, James began noticing her distance. She avoided his gaze, kept conversations brief, and declined invitations to join events at the center. He sensed something was wrong, but couldn't pinpoint what. His instincts told him Penelope had a hand in it, but Eleanor's silence kept him on the outside. Mrs. Gable tried to intervene. She sat Eleanor down, reminding her that strength meant more than carrying pain alone. But Eleanor struggled to believe it. She feared that speaking up would only feed the rumors, painting her as defensive or guilty. Silence felt safer, even as it consumed her. At the diner, a customer sneered when Eleanor fumbled an order. "Guess the billionaire doesn't pay your bills, huh?" the man said, smirking. The laughter from nearby tables stabbed at her pride. She held back tears until she reached the kitchen, then leaned against the wall, her legs trembling. Even strangers now saw her as a target. That night, Eleanor nearly gave up. She considered pulling Daisy out of the center, retreating into her cramped apartment, and letting the rumors win. Survival on her own terms, however harsh, felt less humiliating than being seen as a beggar or worse. Her heart ached with the weight of surrender. But as she tucked Daisy in, her daughter's tiny hand wrapped around her finger. Daisy's trust anchored her once more, fragile but real. Eleanor realized giving up wasn't an option, not for herself, but for the child who believed in her without question. That trust was a lifeline she couldn't cut. Still, the night ended heavy. Eleanor whispered promises into the darkness, her voice breaking. Just one more day, she told herself. But deep down, she knew she was standing on the edge of her breaking point, and tomorrow might decide everything. Eleanor returned to the community center with Daisy, her heart still heavy from the weight of recent rumors. The playroom buzzed with laughter, crayons scattered across the tables, and blocks tumbling in uneven towers. She tried to focus only on Daisy, reminding herself that her daughter deserved joy, no matter what shadows followed her. Across the room, Sophia Caldwell waved brightly, her smile disarming. Daisy responded with a squeal, reaching toward her with tiny hands. Sophia skipped over, carrying a stuffed rabbit almost as big as she was. "Hi, Daisy," she chirped, settling onto the rug. Without hesitation, Daisy crawled toward her, tugging at the toy with delighted curiosity. Eleanor watched, her defenses bristling, but something about Sophia's ease soothed the tension. The children laughed together, their innocence weaving a moment untouched by judgment or suspicion. James stood nearby, speaking with Mrs. Gable, though his eyes often drifted toward the girls. He noticed the way Eleanor's posture softened slightly, her guarded shoulders easing as Daisy giggled. It wasn't his presence that calmed her, it was his daughter's. Sophia's compassion seemed effortless, untainted by pride or wealth, a gift that reached Eleanor more deeply than words could. James felt gratitude swell in his chest. Eleanor hesitated before kneeling beside the girls. "She likes you," she murmured, her voice almost surprised. Sophia beamed up at her, hugging the rabbit close. "She's funny. She makes me laugh." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's lips curved into a genuine smile. It was small, fleeting, but real, born not of obligation, but of shared joy between two children. The room seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe. Eleanor realized she hadn't heard Daisy laugh like this in days, maybe weeks. Sophia's kindness reached past Eleanor's doubts, reminding her that not all connections came with hidden strings. Children didn't calculate worth or status. They simply embraced whoever made them happy. That truth pierced through Eleanor's walls, leaving her momentarily unguarded. James finally approached, careful not to disturb the fragile balance. "Looks like they're fast friends," he said softly. Eleanor glanced at him, wary but less hostile than before. She nodded, her eyes following Daisy's laughter. "Yes," she admitted. She hasn't smiled this much in a long time. Their exchange was brief, but it carried weight and acknowledgement that kindness could exist without pity. Penelope's sharp eyes flickered from across the hall, her smile thin as glass. She saw the bond forming, and it unsettled her carefully constructed narrative. To her, Sophia's innocence was dangerous. It created a bridge that neither Eleanor nor James had built themselves. Still, Eleanor paid Penelope no mind for once, choosing instead to linger in the comfort of her daughter's joy. Mrs. Gable joined them, placing a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. "Children see the truth before we do," she said knowingly. Eleanor swallowed hard, realizing the older woman was right. She wanted to resist, to push back against hope, but the evidence played at her feet. Daisy and Sophia laughing in unison, unbothered by pride, wealth, or gossip. The moment stretched longer than Eleanor expected, and for once, she allowed herself to simply sit. She watched the girls share blocks, babble nonsense, and collapse into giggles. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was simple, human, and necessary. Something fragile within her heart loosened, and for the first time, she wondered if letting her guard down might not be weakness after all. As the playdate ended, Sophia hugged Daisy tightly, promising to bring another toy next time. Eleanor gathered her daughter, her eyes moist, but her spirit lighter. She whispered a thank you, barely audible, as James led Sophia away. She wasn't sure if he heard, but it didn't matter. Tonight, she would carry Daisy home with laughter echoing in her ears, a reminder that innocence could heal wounds pride could not. Later that night, James sat in his study, the city glowing like a constellation beyond the glass. Papers were scattered across his desk, but his focus lingered on an old leather-bound journal. He had pulled it from a drawer earlier, his grandfather's handwriting looping across the yellowed pages. The story of survival was there of a soldier named Thomas Vance, who had carried him to safety through the mud of Europe. His pulse quickened as he traced the name. Vance. The same name Eleanor carried with such quiet dignity. Could it be mere coincidence? James leaned back, memories of his grandfather's gravelly voice echoing in his ears. "That man saved my life. Without him, you wouldn't be here today." The truth struck him with sudden force. Eleanor's presence wasn't random. It was the continuation of a debt decades old. At the same hour, Eleanor rocked Daisy to sleep in their cramped apartment. She hummed softly, her great-grandfather's stories weaving through her mind tales of sacrifice, courage, and a will to survive against impossible odds. She often thought of those stories as distant legends, too far removed from her daily battles. Little did she know, those very sacrifices were etched into the life of the man who had once bought her daughter's formula. James closed the journal with trembling hands, the weight of revelation pressing against his chest. This wasn't just compassion anymore. It was legacy, honor, and destiny entwined. He realized that his urge to help Eleanor wasn't merely kindness, it was an unspoken bond written long before either of them was born. His grandfather had owed his life to hers, and now, perhaps, he was the one called to repay that debt. The following day at the community center, James spotted Eleanor across the room. She bent down to help Daisy stack colorful blocks, her laughter light but cautious. He felt the truth burning inside him, desperate to be spoken. Yet he hesitated. How could he tell her? To Eleanor, it might sound like pity disguised as fate. He didn't want her to think she was bound to him by obligation. Sophia tugged his sleeve, her eyes bright. "Daddy, are we going to play with Daisy again?" Her words pulled him back to the present, grounding him. He nodded, though his mind was still tangled in the revelation. For now, he chose silence. The truth was too heavy to drop into Eleanor's already burdened hands without care. It needed the right time, the right moment. Eleanor noticed his gaze, her chest tightening with unease. James's expression held something deeper than usual, something she couldn't name. She turned away, unwilling to let curiosity break through her defenses. Yet that night, when she tucked Daisy into her crib, she found herself remembering her great-grandfather's words. "Our actions echo for generations." The thought lingered, though she couldn't explain why. James confided only in Mrs. Gable for the moment, sharing the name in the journal. Her sharp eyes softened with recognition, and she placed a hand over his. "If this is true, it changes everything," she said quietly. He nodded, knowing she was right. Their families weren't just connected by chance, they were bound by sacrifice, a thread of history weaving them together. As the days passed, James's resolve grew stronger. He knew he couldn't keep this secret forever. Eleanor deserved to understand the depth of their bond, to know that her great-grandfather's legacy had lived on not just in stories, but in the very life of the man standing before her. He promised himself he would tell her soon. Not as charity, not as leverage, but as truth. The revelation was a turning point, though Eleanor didn't yet see it. For her life remained a daily battle of bills, work, and whispers. But destiny had already shifted. The threads of history were drawing her and James closer, not by accident, but by the unbreakable weight of gratitude passed down through generations. And when the truth finally reached her ears, nothing between them would ever be the same. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Eleanor sat at the far end of the long table, Daisy's photo tucked inside her purse for courage. Across from her, Penelope Covington adjusted her pearls, her eyes sharp as blades. Around them, board members shuffled papers and whispered, waiting for the storm to begin. The atmosphere felt less like a meeting and more like a trial. James sat near the head of the table, posture calm but eyes burning with resolve. Sophia wasn't there today, but her laughter lingered in his memory, a reminder of why he was fighting. Mrs. Gable sat beside Eleanor, her hand resting lightly on the young mother's arm, a silent signal that she wasn't alone. Still, Eleanor felt her throat tighten, every nerve screaming to flee. Penelope's voice broke the quiet, smooth, and cutting. "We must ask ourselves," she began, "whether the center's resources are being exploited by individuals who have no real commitment to its mission." Her gaze fell deliberately on Eleanor. Murmurs rippled across the table, curiosity mixing with doubt. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if anyone else could hear it. "Eleanor Vance has benefited from our programs," Penelope continued. "But what do we truly know of her? Whispers in the community suggest connections to Mr. Caldwell that raise questions of impropriety. Is this charity or manipulation?" Her words landed like darts, sharp and unrelenting. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with heat, shame and anger colliding inside her chest. James leaned forward, his voice steady. "This is not a trial of Eleanor's worth," he said firmly. "It's a test of our values. If we let rumors dictate our actions, we abandon the very families the center was built to serve." But Penelope only smiled, as if expecting his defense. "Then perhaps you should tell us why you've taken such personal interest in her," she pressed. The room grew tense, silence wrapping around them like a vice. Eleanor wanted to speak, but fear pinned her tongue. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting for her to prove or disprove the accusations hanging in the air. For a moment, she considered standing and walking out, ending the humiliation. But Daisy's face flashed in her mind, reminding her of what was at stake. James drew a breath and reached into his briefcase. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a leather-bound journal, worn with age. "Because this isn't just about Eleanor," he said, his voice low but powerful. "It's about legacy." He placed the journal on the table, the weight of history settling like stone. Her great-grandfather, Private Thomas Vance, saved my grandfather's life during the war. Gasps spread across the room, followed by a rush of whispers. James opened the journal to a faded entry, reading aloud his grandfather's words of gratitude. The story painted not charity, but a debt owed across generations. Without Thomas Vance, James concluded, none of us would even know the name James Caldwell. This is not favoritism. This is honor. Penelope's smile faltered, but her voice sharpened. Touching, she said, but unverifiable. Are we to build programs on sentiment? Yet doubt had begun to shift in the room. Board members leaned closer to the journal, their expressions softening. The truth carried a gravity that no rumor could erase. Eleanor's pulse steadied, courage flickering in her chest. She realized the moment was hers to claim. Slowly, she stood, her hands trembling but her voice finding strength. I didn't ask for this, she said, her eyes sweeping the table. But I won't let whispers define me or my daughter. I'm here because I believe dignity belongs to every family who walks through those doors. This is not about charity, it's about respect. The room fell silent, waiting for what came next. The silence after Eleanor's words stretched long and heavy. For a moment, no one moved, as though the entire room was holding its breath. Penelope narrowed her eyes, ready to strike again, but Eleanor lifted her chin higher, refusing to shrink back. Strength poured through her, not from pride alone, but from the thought of Daisy's future. My great-grandfather fought for dignity, Eleanor continued, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. He didn't ask who deserved saving, he just acted. That same dignity is what I want for my daughter. I don't need pity, and I don't need handouts. What I need, what families like mine need, are opportunities to stand on our own. Her words rang like steel against glass. A board member cleared his throat, breaking the tension. She's right, he murmured, his tone carrying weight. Heads nodded around the table, slowly at first, then more firmly. Penelope shifted uncomfortably, realizing her grip on the room was loosening. She tried to interject, but her voice was drowned beneath the rising murmurs of agreement. James watched Eleanor with quiet admiration. This was her moment, not his. His grandfather's journal might have opened the door, but her courage was what carried the room. For the first time, Eleanor was not just surviving, she was leading. The transformation stirred something deep within him, something more powerful than obligation. Penelope made one last attempt. We risk setting a dangerous precedent, she warned. If every sob story becomes a grant, our mission collapses. But Eleanor turned to her calmly, steady as stone. This isn't about a sob story. It's about honoring the sacrifices of those who came before us, and ensuring their families aren't forgotten. That's not dangerous, it's necessary, Mrs. Gable smiled faintly, pride shining in her eyes. She leaned toward the board, her voice warm but firm. I believe we've heard enough. It's time to vote. Papers rustled as ballots were passed, pens scratching against paper. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she stood tall, refusing to let fear undo her resolve. The votes were counted quickly, and the result was unanimous. The Vance legacy grant would not only continue but expand. Eleanor felt the air rush from her lungs, relief and triumph mixing into something indescribable. For the first time in years, the future felt less like a cliff's edge and more like a path. James exhaled quietly, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the table. She didn't smile, not yet, but her nod carried a weight of acknowledgement, respect, not dependence. It was enough. In that moment, they weren't benefactor and recipient, but equals connected by history and dignity. Penelope gathered her papers stiffly, her defeat hidden behind a brittle smile. This isn't over, she muttered under her breath, though few cared to listen. Her pearls clicked together as she left the room, her figure retreating into the hallway. For now, her power had fractured. Eleanor sat down slowly, her hands trembling again, but this time with victory rather than fear. She had not been silenced, not been broken by whispers or shame. She had claimed her worth in front of those who doubted her. As she touched the photo of Daisy in her purse, she whispered softly, "We did it," and for the first time, She truly believed it. The days following the board's decision felt like a sunrise breaking through long shadows. Eleanor walked into the community center with Daisy on her hip, not as a guest unsure of her place, but as someone who had claimed her worth in front of the very people who doubted her. The air seemed lighter, conversations warmer, and for once she didn't feel like an outsider walking through glass doors. Pride no longer burned as a shield, it steadied her as a foundation. James observed quietly from across the hall, Sophia skipping beside him with her usual cheer. He had fought many battles in corporate boardrooms, but this one had been different. It wasn't about profits or influence, it was about legacy. Seeing Eleanor stand tall reminded him that wealth alone could never honor the sacrifices of the past. It required voices like hers, strong and unyielding, to give dignity real meaning. The Vance legacy grant expanded quickly, opening doors for dozens of families who carried their own unseen battles. Veterans' descendants came forward, each with stories of hardship and resilience that echoed Eleanor's. She found herself listening, guiding, and learning, realizing that her pain had carved out a rare kind of empathy. She wasn't just receiving help anymore, she was becoming a leader who could shape change. Nights in the cramped apartment shifted into late hours of study and planning. Eleanor enrolled in courses, driven by a determination that no longer came from survival alone, but from vision. Daisy's giggles filled the small space, mixing with the rustle of papers and the glow of a laptop. Every step forward felt like defiance against the years of doubt that had once cornered her. Every small victory was a brick laid in the foundation of a new future. At the center, Mrs. Gable watched Eleanor with quiet pride. She had seen countless families pass through those halls, many broken by circumstance, but few who carried such fire to rebuild. "You remind me of why this place exists," she told Eleanor one evening, her voice warm but firm. The words settled deep in Eleanor's chest, not as flattery, but as a responsibility she was finally ready to carry. James remained a steady presence, though never overbearing. His support was there in the quiet moments, in the way Sophia played with Daisy, in the brief nods of encouragement across a crowded room, in the respect he gave her choices. Their bond was no longer built on pity or obligation, but on a shared recognition of history and the lives touched by it. What began as a can of formula had become a legacy neither of them could deny. Penelope, though silent for now, lingered like a shadow at the edges of meetings. Her defeat in the boardroom hadn't erased her ambition. Eleanor sensed that challenges would come again, but she no longer felt powerless to face them. The whispers that once cut her down had lost their sting. She had proven her voice carried weight, and that truth would not be easily undone. Graduation day came faster than Eleanor expected. She walked across the stage, her cap and gown symbols of battles won in quiet kitchens and crowded diners. Daisy clapped from Mrs. Lopez's lap in the audience, her laughter carrying across the hall. Eleanor accepted her degree with tears in her eyes, knowing it was more than a piece of paper, it was a promise fulfilled, a future rewritten. Weeks later, she stood at the podium as the newly appointed director of the foundation. The room was filled with families, veterans, board members, and children who would one day carry forward the very legacy she had fought to honor. Her speech was simple but strong. "This grant is not charity. It is respect. It is dignity passed from one generation to the next, and it belongs to all of us." Applause rose, not out of politeness, but out of shared belief. That night, Eleanor returned home and placed Daisy gently in her crib. She stood by the window of the same apartment, but the walls no longer felt like a cage. They were temporary steps in a journey that stretched forward with possibility. She whispered softly, "We made it, babe." Daisy stirred, her tiny hand curling in sleep. Eleanor smiled, knowing the story of the Vance family had been reborn not in wealth, but in courage, dignity, and hope that would echo for generations to come.